My name is Sarah Calloway. I'm 29 years old, and I've been married to my husband Daniel for 5 years. Last month, we hosted a baby shower at our home to celebrate our first child, a little girl we'd already named Olivia. The house was full of people we loved, the decorations were pink and gold, and everything felt like a dream come true. But right in the middle of that afternoon, my mother-in-law stood up in front of every single guest and told them I had been lying about the pregnancy. She said the baby wasn't Daniel's. And within seconds, the entire room went silent and turned toward me. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just smiled. Because 2 minutes later, I walked to the center of the room, opened my laptop, and what I showed everyone on that screen didn't just save my marriage. It exposed something my mother-in-law had been hiding for a very long time. But before I tell you what happened, if you're new here, welcome to Heart Path Stories. Hit the like button, subscribe so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling me what state or country you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the day that changed everything. It was a Saturday in early spring. The kind of afternoon where the sun comes through the curtains and makes everything look a little warmer than it actually is. Our living room had been completely transformed pink, and white balloons floated near the ceiling. A long table against the wall held sandwiches, fruit, little pink cupcakes, and a tiered cake with a tiny pair of baby shoes on top. My closest friends were there. My mom and my aunt had driven in from 2 states away. Several of Daniel's relatives filled the rest of the seats. Daniel was in the kitchen refilling a pitcher of lemonade when I noticed her. My mother-in-law, Margaret, was standing near the window on the far side of the room. She wasn't talking to anyone. She wasn't smiling, she was watching me. Not the way a proud grandmother-to-be watches her son's wife at a baby shower. It was different. It was the same look she had given me the very first time Daniel brought me home to meet his family, quiet, measuring, like she was searching for something she could use. Margaret and I had never been close. I had accepted that early on and made peace with it. She was a proud woman who had spent decades running her family's small real estate business alongside Daniel's father, and from the moment I married her son, she treated me the way some people treat a house guest who has overstayed their welcome. Polite enough on the surface, but always with that undercurrent of distance. Over the years, there had been comments, nothing anyone else would notice. Little things she would say when Daniel was out of earshot. You know he was going to propose to someone else before he met you. Or, at our wedding rehearsal dinner, I hope you understand what kind of family you're marrying into. We have standards. When I got pregnant, I thought maybe things would change. A grandchild had a way of softening people. And for a few weeks, it seemed like it might. She called more often. She asked about my appointments. She offered to help plan the shower. But standing across the room that afternoon, watching her watch me, I could feel that something had shifted. She had the same expression she wore when she thought she knew something no one else did. A quiet, contained kind of confidence that sat just behind her eyes. I told myself I was being paranoid. I turned back to my guests and kept smiling. About an hour into the party, after the games and the gifts and the moment where my mom cried a little holding up a tiny onesie with ducks on it, someone suggested it was time to cut the cake. A few guests gathered their phones to take pictures. Daniel came in from the kitchen, stood beside me, wrapped one arm around my shoulders, and kissed the side of my head. He looked genuinely happy. I had been waiting for that moment for months. But before anyone could hand me the knife, Margaret set down her glass and stood up. The room noticed immediately. She had a presence that filled a space without needing to try. She looked around at the guests, and then she looked at me, and she said she had something she needed to share. That it wasn't easy for her, but that she loved her son too much to stay quiet. Daniel lowered his arm slightly. I felt the shift in his body before I even processed her words. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of printed pages. She said she had spoken to someone, a private investigator. She said the results had been difficult to accept, but that everyone in this room deserved to know the truth before they celebrated something built on a lie. Someone near the back of the room quietly said, "Oh my God." Margaret held up the pages and said she had reason to believe the baby was not Daniel's. The room didn't explode, it went completely still. That kind of silence that's almost louder than noise, where you can hear the air conditioning hum and the sound of someone setting a glass down too carefully. Then the whispers started. People looked at each other and then at me. I saw my mother's face go pale across the room. I saw Daniel's cousin lean toward his wife and say something under his breath. Daniel had gone very still beside me. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at the pages in his mother's hand. Margaret placed them on the table. She spoke in a calm, measured voice, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this moment and said she understood this was painful, but that she was doing this because she loved her son. She looked at me only once, briefly, and then looked away. And that was when something settled inside me. Not anger. Not panic. Something quieter than both of those things. I smiled. My best friend noticed first. She was sitting 2 seats away and she looked at me with wide eyes, clearly waiting for me to break down or fight back or walk out of the room. But I didn't do any of those things. I just stood there with my hands resting gently on my stomach and smiled like someone who had heard a joke the rest of the room hadn't caught up to yet. Margaret noticed the smile too. It threw her. Her carefully composed expression flickered for just half a second. Daniel finally turned toward me. His voice was quiet and careful. He said my name like a question. I looked at him, then at Margaret, then slowly around the room. And I said very calmly that I was glad she brought this up today. That actually, I had been wanting to share something with everyone myself. And I asked if she would mind if I grabbed my laptop from the bedroom. Margaret blinked. She said that wasn't necessary, that the pages spoke for themselves. But I had already turned toward the hallway. I heard the murmuring pick up behind me. I heard Daniel say something to his mother in a low voice. I took a slow breath, walked into the bedroom, picked up my laptop from the nightstand, and carried it back into the living room. By the time I returned, the room had rearranged itself slightly. People had shifted in their seats. Margaret was still standing, her arms crossed now, her expression recalibrated into something more defensive. Daniel was beside her, looking between the pages on the table and the door I had just walked back through. I set the laptop on the coffee table. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I looked at Margaret and asked her to walk me through the document she had shared. I said it calmly, the way you ask someone to explain their reasoning when you already know where the cracks are. She gestured at the pages and said a private investigator had looked into my background. That I had been seen meeting with another man. That the timing of the pregnancy didn't add up. I nodded slowly. I asked if I could look at the pages. She pushed them across the table toward me. I picked them up. I looked at them carefully. The room was completely silent. Then I set them back down and said, "These are from 8 months ago." Margaret said that was correct. I asked if she knew where I was 8 months ago, specifically on the dates circled on the report. She said she did. That was the point of the report. I nodded again. And then I finally opened the laptop. Margaret's eyes moved to the screen. She couldn't see it from where she was standing, but something in her expression told me she was paying very close attention. I turned the laptop to face the room. On the screen was a photograph. Me and a man, taken from a distance, in what looked like a parking lot outside a medical building. The photograph was part of the investigator's report, but the version on my screen was the full original file with metadata visible along the side. I pointed to the date stamp on the image. Then I pulled up a second document beside it. A calendar. My medical appointment history from my OB's patient portal. I said, 8 months ago, I was going to a fertility specialist. Every single week. Because Daniel and I had been trying for 2 years to get pregnant, and we were starting to lose hope. The man in that photograph is Dr. James Okafor. He is a reproductive endocrinologist. And he is the reason Olivia exists. I let the room sit with that for a moment. Then I turned the laptop slightly so Margaret could see the screen more clearly. I pointed to Dr. Okafor's name on the appointment records. I pointed to the clinic's letterhead. I pointed to the date on the photograph matching exactly the date of my Tuesday afternoon appointment, confirmed in the system with a check-in timestamp. Someone in the room exhaled. Someone else said, "Oh." Daniel stepped forward and looked at the screen. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the appointment records. Then he looked at his mother. His voice was different when he spoke now. He asked her quietly where she had gotten this report. Margaret opened her mouth and then closed it again. I kept my voice steady. I said I wasn't finished yet. Because here was the thing. When Margaret first started inserting herself into conversations about the pregnancy, asking questions that felt less like interest and more like investigation, I had gotten a strange feeling. Not the kind of feeling you can explain. Just the sense that something was off. So about 6 weeks ago, I had mentioned it to my cousin, who works in cybersecurity. Not to spy on anyone. Just to make sure our home Wi-Fi was secure, our accounts were protected, that kind of thing. And while he was looking into things, he found something. Margaret's posture shifted slightly. Her arms tightened across her chest. I navigated to another tab on the laptop. This one showed a financial document. A series of transfers from the family real estate business account, the one both Margaret and Daniel were co-signers on since Daniel had been brought in as a partner 3 years ago. 14 transfers. Over the course of 8 months, each one moving a modest amount, nothing flashy, nothing that would trigger an automatic alert on its own into a separate account. An account that was not part of the business. I had asked Daniel's accountant to look at it quietly 2 weeks ago. He had confirmed what my cousin suspected. The separate account belonged to Margaret. The room did not go silent this time. It erupted. People leaned forward. I heard Daniel's aunt say something sharp. I heard my mother breathe in sharply across the room. Daniel looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. His jaw was tight. He asked me, quietly, how much? I told him. Just over $60,000. Moved out over 8 months. Starting almost exactly when Daniel had brought up the idea of buying out his mother's share of the business so he could run it independently. Margaret's face had gone from composed to pale to something I could only describe as trapped. She said it wasn't what it looked like. She said she had expenses, that she had planned to pay it back. That Daniel didn't understand the pressure she was under. Daniel turned toward her slowly. He looked like someone trying to remember how to breathe normally. He asked her, and his voice was so quiet the room had to lean in if she had commissioned that investigator's report to distract from this. To give everyone a reason to look at me instead of at her. Margaret shook her head quickly, but the movement was too fast, too eager. I said I couldn't answer that for her. But I could say that the report had been commissioned 6 weeks after Daniel first mentioned restructuring the business. And that my cousin had found the financial irregularities the same week the investigator apparently started following me. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Anyone in that room could see it. One of Daniel's uncles, a quiet man who had sat near the back without saying anything, stood up slowly. He had known Margaret for 30 years. He looked at her for a long moment without expression. Then he looked at Daniel and said he thought they needed to have a serious conversation, not today, but soon. And that he was sorry this had happened at a baby shower of all places. A few people nodded. The room had entirely reoriented itself. The whispers that had been directed at me 10 minutes earlier were now directed at the woman standing alone near the window. Margaret picked up the printed pages from the table. She straightened them. She looked at me one more time, not with contempt this time, but with something that might have been the beginning of understanding, and then she walked toward the front door without saying anything else. When the door closed behind her, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Daniel sat down on the arm of the couch. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. I sat beside him. I put my hand over his and waited. After a moment, he looked up. He said he didn't know. He hadn't known any of it, not the transfers, not the investigator, not the plan. He said he was so sorry, that he should have trusted me the moment she stood up, that he had let the shock take over and he hated himself for the half second where he had looked at those pages instead of at me. I told him I understood. I told him that half second wasn't what defined us. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked down at my stomach, at Olivia, and put his hand very gently over mine. From somewhere behind us, my best friend quietly said, "So, cake?" A few people laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from relief more than anything else. My mom was already on her feet, cutting the first slice with the determined energy of a woman who had not driven 400 miles to leave without dessert. Someone put music back on. The room slowly, imperfectly, carefully came back to life. We did cut the cake that afternoon. We did celebrate. It looked different than I had imagined it that morning, quieter in some places and louder in others, with a few tear-stained faces in the photos we took by the end of it. 3 weeks later, Daniel sat down with his uncle and an attorney. The transfers were documented. The business accounts were audited. Margaret returned the money quietly, without a fight, through her own attorney and signed over her remaining share of the business to settle the matter privately. There were no criminal charges filed. That was Daniel's choice, and I respected it even though I understood why some people might have made a different one. She has not been in contact with us since. I don't know what she tells people. I don't know how she explains it to herself. I stopped trying to answer those questions a long time ago because Olivia is due in 7 weeks, and the room she's coming home to is full of more love than I know what to do with. What I do know is this. The afternoon my mother-in-law stood up at my baby shower and tried to dismantle my marriage in front of everyone I love, she didn't know that I had already found the thread she'd been hoping no one would pull. She thought the best defense was a good offense. She thought I would be too shocked, too hurt, too publicly humiliated to think clearly. She didn't know that I had spent 2 years fighting for the life I was building. That I had driven to a clinic every Tuesday for months and sat in a waiting room and hoped and prayed and tried again. That I was not the kind of woman who walks away from what she loves without a fight. She thought she knew something I didn't. She had no idea how much I knew. And on the afternoon that was supposed to celebrate the beginning of my daughter's story, the only thing that ended was the silence I had kept for far too long.